The dust kicked up by Sarah Mackenzie's boots as she walked across the dry earth of her ranch told the story of 3 years without enough rain. The Mackenzie spread had once been the pride of Clearwater territory, with green pastures stretching as far as a person could see and cattle so fat they barely moved in the summer heat. Now the grass was brown and brittle, breaking like old bones underfoot. Sarah stopped at the edge of what used to be Miller's Creek. The water that had run clear and cold for generations was nothing more than cracked mud now. She knelt down and picked up a handful of the dried earth, letting it fall through her fingers like sand in an hourglass. Time was running out for everyone in Clearwater territory. At 42 years old, Sarah had weathered more storms than most folks twice her age. When her husband Tom died in a stampede 5 years ago, people said she would never make it as a rancher. Women didn't run cattle operations, they said. She was too soft, too emotional, too weak for such hard work. But Sarah had proved them all wrong. She kept the ranch going through sheer determination and a backbone made of Texas steel. The problem wasn't Sarah's ability to run cattle. The problem was there wasn't any water left to run them on. The drought had started small, the way most disasters do. 1 dry month turned into 2, then 4, then a whole year without proper rain. Wells that had never run dry in living memory were now empty holes in the ground. Cattle were dying by the hundreds across the territory. Families who had worked the land for generations were packing up and leaving, heading east where the rivers still ran full. Sarah's foreman, Miguel Rodriguez, rode up on his bay horse as she stood looking at the dead creek. Miguel had worked for the Mackenzie family for 15 years, since he was barely old enough to sit a horse properly. He was more like family than hired help, and Sarah trusted his judgment more than any man alive. "Morning, Mrs. Mackenzie," Miguel said, touching the brim of his worn hat. "Got some news from town you're not going to like." Sarah stood up and brushed the dust from her hands. "Bad news seems to be all anyone has these days. What is it now?" "The Cartwrights sold out yesterday. Took half what their spread was worth just to get out before winter sets in." Miguel's dark eyes were serious. "That makes 12 families gone in the past 2 months." The Cartwright Ranch bordered Sarah's property to the north. They had been good neighbors, always ready to help during roundup or when someone had trouble with rustlers. Now they would join the steady stream of wagons heading east, carrying everything they owned and leaving behind the dreams they had built on this hard land. "What about the water rights to their creek?" Sarah asked. "That's the real bad news," Miguel said, climbing down from his horse. "Word is that Marcus Thornfield bought up all the water rights along with the land. He's planning to dam up Willow Creek and sell water to whoever can pay his prices." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Marcus Thornfield was a wealthy businessman from back east who had been buying up failed ranches across the territory for the past year. He claimed he wanted to help rebuild the region, but everyone knew he was just waiting for the drought to break so he could sell the land for 10 times what he paid. In the meantime, he charged high prices for anything people needed to survive. "Can he legally do that?" Sarah asked. "Willow Creek feeds half the ranches in the territory." "Legal or not, he's got the papers to prove he owns the water now," Miguel replied. "Judge Harrison signed off on it yesterday morning. Thornfield's already started building his dam." This was worse than Sarah had imagined. Willow Creek was the last reliable water source within 50 miles. If Thornfield controlled it, he could squeeze every remaining rancher until they had no choice but to sell to him for whatever price he offered. It was a clever plan, and perfectly legal under territorial law. "There's more," Miguel continued. "I talked to some of the boys who work for Thornfield. They say he's planning to meet with all the remaining ranch owners next week, going to offer to buy everyone out at fair prices, but only if they all agree to sell. If some folks hold out, he says the prices will get lower every month." Sarah had heard about Thornfield's tactics in other territories. He would identify the key landowners and pressure them until they either sold or went bankrupt trying to hold on. Once he owned enough land, he could control the water, the grazing rights, and eventually the whole economy of the region. Then he would bring in his own people to work the ranches and keep all the profits for himself. "How many ranchers are left?" Sarah asked. "Counting us? Maybe 8 operations big enough to matter," Miguel said. "The Henderson Place, the Double Bar S, the Martinez family spread, and a few others. But most of them are hanging on by their fingernails. One more bad month and they'll have to sell whether they want to or not." Sarah walked back toward the ranch house, her mind working through the problem like a chess player studying the board. Thornfield had been smart and patient. He had waited for the drought to weaken everyone, then moved in to buy up the water rights. Now he was in position to force out all the remaining ranchers and take over the entire territory. The Mackenzie ranch house sat on a small hill overlooking the valley. Tom had built it with his own hands when they were first married, adding rooms as their dreams grew bigger. They had planned to raise a house full of children here, but that dream died with Tom. Now the house felt too big and too empty, but Sarah couldn't bear the thought of leaving it behind. Inside, she poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot that stayed warm on the stove all day. The coffee was weak because supplies from town were getting expensive, but it was still coffee. She sat at the kitchen table where she and Tom had made so many plans for their future and tried to think of a way out of this mess. The numbers were simple and brutal. The Mackenzie Ranch was worth about $8,000 in good times, but with the drought and Thornfield's pressure, she might get $3,000 if she sold now. That money wouldn't last long, and it certainly wouldn't buy another ranch anywhere else. She could try to wait out the drought, but without access to water from Willow Creek, her remaining cattle would die within months. There was a knock at the front door. Sarah wasn't expecting anyone, but visitors were always welcome in ranch country. She opened the door to find Judge Harrison standing on her porch, hat in hand and a worried look on his weathered face. "Afternoon, Sarah," the judge said. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk." Judge Harrison had been the territorial judge for 20 years. He was an honest man who tried to do right by everyone, but he was also bound by the law whether he liked it or not. Sarah had known him since she was a girl, and she could tell by his expression that he wasn't bringing good news. "Of course. Judge, come sit down. Can I get you some coffee?" "That would be welcome," he said, settling his large frame into one of the kitchen chairs. "This drought has me more tired than I care to admit." Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from the judge. He was usually a man of many words, but today he seemed to be struggling with how to begin. "I suppose you heard about Thornfield buying the Cartwright place," he finally said. "Miguel told me this morning. Also heard about the water rights to Willow Creek." Judge Harrison nodded grimly. "That's what I need to talk to you about. Thornfield came to see me yesterday after the papers were signed. He's planning to make an offer to buy out all the remaining ranchers next week, including you." "I figured as much," Sarah said. "What kind of offer?" "Fair market price for the land, minus what he calculates you'll lose from the drought. For most folks, that comes out to about half what their spreads were worth 2 years ago." The judge took a sip of his coffee and grimaced slightly. "For you, he's talking about $4,000 for the whole Mackenzie operation." $4,000 was more than Sarah had expected, but it was still far less than the ranch was truly worth. More importantly, it was the end of everything she and Tom had built together. "There's something else," Judge Harrison continued. "Thornfield says if everyone agrees to sell, he'll guarantee jobs for anyone who wants to stay and work for his new operation. But if some folks hold out and force him to wait, those job offers disappear." Sarah understood the threat. Thornfield was dividing the community against itself. If one person refused to sell, everyone else would suffer. It was a cruel but effective strategy. "What do you think I should do, Judge?" Sarah asked. The old man was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if he could find answers there. "Legally, I can't advise you one way or another. But personally, He looked up and met her eyes. "I think Thornfield is trying to steal this whole territory, and I wish there was something I could do to stop him." After Judge Harrison left, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen as the sun set over the brown hills. Outside, she could hear Miguel and the other hands finishing the day's work. There wasn't much to do anymore with so few cattle left, but the routines of ranch life continued out of habit and hope. She thought about Tom and how he would have handled this situation. He had always been a fighter, never backing down from anyone or anything. But he had also been practical. When the odds were impossible, he knew when to fold his cards and wait for a better hand. The question was whether this was the time to fight or the time to fold. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She walked out onto the porch and looked up at the stars that seemed brighter now, without any moisture in the air. The night was quiet except for the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other across the empty land. She thought about all the families who had already given up and left. Good people who had worked hard and played by the rules, only to be driven out by circumstances beyond their control. She thought about the communities that were dying as the ranches failed, the children who would grow up somewhere else because their parents couldn't make a living here anymore. Most of all, she thought about Thornfield and his plans to turn this whole territory into his personal kingdom. He didn't care about the land or the people who had made their lives here. To him, it was all just numbers on a ledger, property to be bought and sold for profit. By morning, Sarah had made her decision. But it wasn't the decision anyone would have expected. She rode into town early, before most people were stirring. Clearwater wasn't much to look at these days. Half the businesses were boarded up, and the ones that remained open were struggling to survive as the ranching community collapsed around them. The bank, the general store, the saloon, and the church were about all that was left. Sarah tied her horse outside the telegraph office and went inside. The operator, a thin man named Pete, who had been sending messages for 30 years, looked up in surprise. "Morning, Mrs. Mackenzie. Didn't expect to see you this early. What can I do for you?" "I need to send a telegram to Austin," Sarah said. "To the territorial governor's office." Pete raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask questions. He was paid to send messages, not to wonder about their contents. "What's the message?" Sarah had rehearsed the words in her mind during the sleepless night. "Request immediate meeting regarding water rights crisis in Clearwater Territory. Critical situation requiring territorial intervention. Signed, Sarah Mackenzie." After sending the telegram, Sarah rode back to the ranch with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She didn't know if the governor would respond or if he would care about the problems of a remote territory. But she had to try something different before Thornfield's plan succeeded completely. Miguel was waiting for her when she returned. "Where did you go so early?" he asked. "Into town to send a message," Sarah replied. "We might have visitors soon." "What kind of visitors?" Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. The kind that might change everything. 3 days later, a dusty rider approached the Mackenzie Ranch carrying a message from Austin. The territorial governor was sending a representative to investigate the situation in Clearwater Territory. He would arrive within the week to meet with local residents and assess the water rights crisis. Sarah felt a spark of hope, but she knew this was only the beginning. Thornfield had money and legal documents on his side. She had only the truth and the desperate hope that someone in authority would care enough to help. The real battle for Clearwater Territory was about to begin, and Sarah Mackenzie was preparing to make a move that would shock everyone who thought they knew her. The territorial representative arrived on a Tuesday morning when the sun was already hot enough to make the air shimmer above the brown grass. Sarah watched from her porch as the official wagon rolled up the dusty path to her ranch house, followed by 3 riders she didn't recognize. The man climbing down from the driver's seat was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of clean clothes and soft hands that marked him as someone who worked with papers instead of cattle. Mrs. Judd, Mackenzie, the young man called out, approaching the porch with his hat in his hand. I'm James Crawford, Special Investigator for the Territorial Governor's Office. Thank you for your telegram regarding the situation here in Clearwater Territory. Sarah stepped forward and shook his hand, noting the firm grip despite his city appearance. Mr. Crawford, welcome to the Mackenzie Ranch. I appreciate you coming all this way. The governor takes water rights disputes very seriously, Crawford replied, especially when they involve allegations of territorial manipulation. He gestured toward the three men who had followed him. These gentlemen are territorial surveyors and legal clerks. We're here to conduct a full investigation into the recent land and water acquisitions. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and nervousness. This was what she had wanted, but now that help had arrived, she realized how much was riding on convincing these officials that Thornfield's actions threatened the entire territory. Would you like to come inside and discuss the situation? Sarah offered. I have documents that might interest you. Crawford nodded and followed her into the house, while his assistants began unloading surveying equipment from their wagon. Sarah had spent the past 3 days gathering every piece of paper related to water rights, land grants, and territorial law she could find. The kitchen table was covered with documents dating back to the original territorial charter. Impressive collection, Crawford said, examining the papers. You've been busy. When you're fighting for your life, you learn to be thorough, Sarah replied. Can I offer you some coffee while we go through this? As they sat at the table, Sarah explained the situation in detail. She told Crawford about the drought, the failing ranches, and Thornfield's systematic acquisition of properties and water rights. She showed him the contracts and deeds that gave Thornfield control over Willow Creek, and explained how he was using that control to force out the remaining ranchers. Crawford listened carefully, taking notes in a leather-bound book. Occasionally, he would ask questions about dates, prices, or legal procedures. Sarah could tell he was smart and thorough, but she couldn't read his expression well enough to know what he was thinking. This Marcus Thornfield, Crawford said finally. I'd like to meet with him today if possible. Can you arrange that? I can send Miguel into town to find him, Sarah said. But I should warn you, Thornfield isn't the kind of man who likes being questioned by government officials. Crawford smiled for the first time since arriving. Mrs. Mackenzie, I've dealt with his type before. Men who think money and legal documents make them untouchable often have the most interesting reactions when someone in authority starts asking difficult questions. While they waited for Miguel to return with word from Thornfield, Sarah took Crawford on a tour of her ranch. She showed him the dried-up creek beds, the empty wells, and the pastures where grass had once grown thick and green. She introduced him to her remaining cattle, explaining how the drought had reduced her herd from over 200 head to less than 50. This was all underwater 3 years ago, Sarah said, pointing to a low area near the main barn. We called it the swimming hole because it was deep enough for the kids in the area to learn to swim. Now look at it. Crawford examined the cracked earth where water had once pooled. The drought has been this severe across the entire territory. Worse in some places, Sarah replied. The Martinez family lost their entire herd last month. They're living on beans and cornbread while they try to decide whether to sell to Thornfield or just pack up and leave with nothing. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Miguel was returning from town, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode Marcus Thornfield himself, along with 2 men who looked more like hired gunmen than ranch hands. Thornfield was a tall, well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from always getting what he wanted. He dismounted from his expensive horse and approached Sarah and Crawford with a politician's smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Mackenzie, Thornfield said with exaggerated courtesy, what a pleasure to see you again. And you must be the gentleman from the territorial government I've been hearing about. Crawford extended his hand. James Crawford, Special Investigator. Mr. Thornfield, I presume? Indeed, Marcus Thornfield, owner of Thornfield Development Company. His handshake was firm and longer than necessary, the kind of power play Sarah had seen from men who were used to intimidating others. "I understand you're here to investigate some concerns about property transactions in our territory." "That's correct," Crawford replied. "I'd like to review your recent acquisitions and discuss your plans for the water rights you've obtained." Thornfield's smile became slightly less friendly. "Of course. Though I should point out that all my transactions have been completely legal and properly documented. I have contracts, deeds, and judicial approval for everything I've done." "I'm sure you do," Crawford said. "Nevertheless, the territorial governor wants to ensure that these transactions serve the best interests of all residents, not just individual business concerns." The two men stared at each other for a moment, and Sarah could feel the tension building. Thornfield was clearly not used to having his actions questioned by anyone, and Crawford was not the type to be impressed by wealth or threats. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more formal setting," Thornfield said finally. "I suggest we meet at the courthouse tomorrow morning, where all the relevant documents can be properly reviewed." "That would be acceptable," Crawford agreed. 10 o'clock? Perfect. I'll have my attorney present, of course. After Thornfield rode away, Crawford turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "Interesting man. He's confident, I'll give him that." "Too confident, if you ask me," Sarah replied. "Men like Thornfield think rules are for other people." That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen going through the documents one more time. Something had been bothering her about the water rights situation, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. She had read through the original territorial charter, the homestead laws, and every deed and contract she could find, but there was still something that didn't feel right. Finally, she found what had been nagging at her. In the original territorial charter, there was a clause about water rights that seemed to conflict with the recent sales Thornfield had made. The charter stated that water rights could only be transferred along with the land itself, and only if the transfer served the general welfare and development of the territory. Sarah read the passage 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. If the charter was still in effect, then Thornfield's purchase of water rights separate from some of the land might not be legal after all, but she needed to be certain before she said anything to Crawford. She walked to the chest where Tom had kept his most important papers. In the back, wrapped in oilcloth, were the original documents from when they had first bought the Mackenzie Ranch. Among them was a copy of the territorial charter that the land office had given them when they registered their claim. Sarah spread the charter out on the kitchen table and began reading it carefully by lamplight. The language was formal and sometimes difficult to understand, but one section made her heart race. According to the charter, all water rights in Clearwater Territory were held in trust for the common benefit of territorial residents. Individual landowners could use water for their own purposes, but they could not transfer water rights to anyone whose intent was to limit access or charge fees that would harm the general welfare. If Sarah was reading this correctly, Thornfield's entire scheme might be built on illegal foundations, but she needed legal confirmation before she could act on this information. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse early. She wanted to speak with Crawford before the formal meeting with Thornfield began. She found him in Judge Harrison's office, reviewing documents with one of his assistants. "Mr. Crawford," Sarah said, "I need to show you something important." She spread the territorial charter out on the judge's desk and pointed to the water rights section. "I think Thornfield's water purchases might violate the original territorial charter." Crawford read the passage carefully, then called over his legal clerk. The two men discussed the language in low tones while Sarah waited nervously. Finally, Crawford looked up with a grim expression. "Mrs. Mackenzie, if this interpretation is correct, then every water rights transaction Thornfield has made could be declared null and void." He paused. but challenging these sales would require someone to file a formal complaint and be willing to face Thornfield's legal team in court. What would that involve? Sarah asked. Substantial legal fees, months or possibly years of litigation, and the risk that if you lose, you could be held liable for Thornfield's costs as well. Crawford's expression was serious. It's not something to undertake lightly. Before Sarah could respond, Thornfield arrived at the courthouse with his attorney and 2 assistants. The meeting began formally, with Crawford asking detailed questions about each property acquisition and water rights transfer. Thornfield's responses were smooth and well-rehearsed, and his attorney had impressive legal documents to support every transaction. For 2 hours, they went through contracts, deeds, and financial records. Thornfield explained his development plans, his investment in the territory, and his commitment to rebuilding the region after the drought. On paper, everything looked legitimate and beneficial. Then Crawford brought up the territorial charter. "Mr. Thornfield," Crawford said, "are you familiar with Section 12 of the original territorial charter regarding water rights?" For the first time, Thornfield looked uncertain. "I'm not sure I recall the specific details of that section." Crawford read the water rights clause aloud. As he spoke, Thornfield's attorney began frantically shuffling through his papers, clearly searching for something he hadn't prepared for. "Based on this charter provision," Crawford continued, "it appears that water rights in this territory cannot be transferred separately from the land and cannot be used in ways that harm the general welfare of territorial residents. How do you reconcile this with your current business model?" Thornfield's face had gone red, but his voice remained steady. "The charter you're referring to is an old document that has been superseded by subsequent territorial laws. My attorney can provide you with the legal precedents." But his attorney was still scrambling through papers and clearly didn't have an immediate answer. The confidence that had carried Thornfield through the first part of the meeting was beginning to crack. Crawford pressed his advantage. "Mr. Thornfield, until we can resolve this charter question, I'm recommending that the territorial government place a temporary hold on all water rights transfers in Clearwater territory." "You can't do that!" Thornfield snapped, his politician's smile finally disappearing completely. "I have legitimate business interests and legal contracts." "You have contracts that may violate territorial law," Crawford replied calmly. "Until that question is resolved, no further water rights can be transferred, and existing transfers are subject to review." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. In the space of a few minutes, Crawford had managed to stop Thornfield's entire operation in its tracks. But she knew this was only the beginning of a long legal battle. After the meeting ended, Thornfield stormed out of the courthouse with his attorney close behind. Sarah could hear them arguing in loud whispers as they walked to their horses. Crawford gathered his papers with satisfaction. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we wait," Crawford replied. "Thornfield will challenge our interpretation of the charter, and there will be legal hearings to determine whether his water rights purchases are valid. In the meantime, he can't buy any more water rights or force anyone else to sell." This was better than Sarah had dared to hope, but she realized that the legal fight ahead would be expensive and difficult. Thornfield had money and experienced lawyers. The territorial government would provide some support, but individual landowners who wanted to challenge his existing contracts would have to hire their own attorneys. That evening, Sarah called a meeting of the remaining ranchers at the schoolhouse in town. Word had spread quickly about the courthouse confrontation, and everyone wanted to know what it meant for their situations. 8 families showed up, representing all the major ranching operations still surviving in Clearwater territory. They sat on wooden benches in the one-room schoolhouse, their faces showing a mixture of hope and skepticism that Sarah recognized all too well. "I'll be straight with you," Sarah began. "We might have a way to stop Thornfield, but it's going to take all of us working together. and it's going to cost money we don't have. She explained about the territorial charter and Crawford's findings. She told them about the legal challenge they could mount against Thornfield's water rights purchases. And she was honest about the risks they would face if they decided to fight. "How much money are we talking about?" asked Bill Henderson, whose family had been ranching in the territory for 20 years. "Crawford estimates it could cost each family around $1,000 in legal fees, maybe more if the case goes on for a long time," Sarah replied. The room was quiet. $1,000 was more than most of these families made in a good year, and none of them had been having good years lately. "What if we lose?" asked Maria Martinez, whose family had already lost their cattle to the drought. "If we lose, we'll probably have to pay Thornfield's legal costs too," Sarah said. "It could mean bankruptcy for all of us." "And if we don't fight," asked another rancher, "then Thornfield gets what he wants. He controls all the water, forces us out one by one, and ends up owning the entire territory." The discussion went on for over an hour. Some families wanted to fight, others thought it was too risky. Everyone was scared, angry, and desperate for a solution that didn't seem to exist. Finally, Sarah stood up and faced her neighbors. What she said next would shock them more than anything that had happened so far. "I've been thinking about this all day," she said. "There's another option, but you're going to think I've lost my mind." The room fell silent. "What if we don't fight Thornfield in court?" Sarah continued. "What if we do something that makes his whole scheme impossible?" "What do you mean?" Henderson asked. Sarah took a deep breath. She had been considering this idea since the courthouse meeting, but saying it out loud made it real in a way that frightened and thrilled her. "What if we give our land away?" The silence in the room was complete. Everyone stared at Sarah as if she had suggested they all jump off a cliff. "Hear me out," Sarah said quickly. "Thornfield's whole plan depends on buying our ranches cheap and controlling the water. But what if he can't buy the ranches because we don't own them anymore?" "Sarah," Henderson said slowly, "the drought has been hard on all of us, but maybe you should sit down and think about what you're saying." "I'm thinking clearer than I have in months," Sarah replied. "What if we deed our ranches to the territorial government as a public trust? All the remaining families could stay and work the land together as a community operation. Thornfield couldn't buy what we don't own, and the territorial charter would protect the water rights for everyone." The idea was so radical that nobody spoke for several minutes. Sarah could see them trying to process what she was suggesting. She was talking about giving up private ownership of land that had been in some families for generations, but she could also see that some of them were beginning to understand the possibilities. "Would something like that even be legal?" Maria Martinez asked. "Crawford thinks it would be," Sarah said. "He mentioned it as a theoretical option when we were discussing ways to protect the water rights. The territorial government has the authority to accept land donations and manage them for the public benefit." "But we'd lose everything," another rancher protested. "Our land, our independence, our legacy." "We're going to lose all that anyway if Thornfield succeeds," Sarah replied. "At least this way we get to stay. Our children get to grow up here. And maybe when the drought ends, we can make this place prosper again." The meeting broke up without any decisions being made. Sarah could tell that her suggestion had shaken everyone, including herself. She had proposed giving up everything she and Tom had worked for, and she wasn't even sure it was the right thing to do. But as she rode home under the stars, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since the drought began, she felt like she had some control over her fate. Thornfield thought he held all the cards, but Sarah Mackenzie was about to play a hand that nobody expected. Tomorrow, she would make her choice. And that choice would change Clearwater territory forever. Sarah Mackenzie stood in the territorial land office at dawn, holding the deed to her ranch in hands that trembled slightly despite her determination. The clerk, A young man named Timothy, who had probably never seen anything like this in his 3 years on the job, stared at her as if she had announced her intention to fly to the moon. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Timothy said carefully, "are you absolutely certain you want to donate your entire ranch to the territorial government? Once these papers are signed, there's no going back." "I'm certain," Sarah replied, though her voice caught slightly on the words. "I want the Mackenzie Ranch to become part of a territorial trust, managed for the benefit of all residents of Clearwater Territory." James Crawford had spent most of the previous evening making sure the legal paperwork was correct. The territorial government could indeed accept private land donations and manage them as public trusts. Sarah's ranch would become territorial property, but she and her workers would have the right to continue living and working on the land as territorial employees. "And you understand," Timothy continued, "that you're giving up all ownership rights? You won't be able to sell this property or pass it down to heirs or make major decisions about its use?" "I understand," Sarah said, "but I'll still have a home here, and so will the people who work for me. That's what matters." She signed her name on the deed transfer documents with the same pen Tom had used to register their original homestead claim 15 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using his pen to give away everything they had built together. Timothy stamped the documents with official seals and filed them in the territorial records. Just like that, the Mackenzie Ranch ceased to exist as private property. Sarah walked out of the land office feeling both lighter and heavier than she had in years. Word of Sarah's actions spread through Clearwater Territory like wildfire. By noon, people were riding out to the former Mackenzie Ranch to see if the stories were true. They found Sarah working alongside Miguel and the other hands, repairing fence lines just as if nothing had changed. "Sarah!" called out Bill Henderson as he rode up to where she was working. "People in town are saying you gave your ranch to the government. Please tell me that's not true." Sarah straightened up and wiped sweat from her forehead. "It's true, Bill. As of this morning, this is territorial land managed for the public benefit." Henderson dismounted and stared at her in amazement. "Have you completely lost your mind? You just gave away $8,000 worth of property." "I gave away property that was about to be taken from me anyway," Sarah replied. "This way, at least I get to stay and help decide what happens to it." Other ranchers began arriving throughout the day. Some came to argue with Sarah, telling her she had made a terrible mistake. Others came to try to understand what she had done and whether it might work for them too. By evening, nearly every remaining ranching family in the territory had gathered at what everyone was still calling the Mackenzie place, though legally it no longer existed. Maria Martinez was the first to speak up in support of Sarah's decision. "I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting," she told the group. "My family is going to lose our ranch anyway. We can't make the payments, and we can't afford to fight Thornfield in court. But if we donated our land to the Territorial Trust, we could stay and work it together with everyone else." "You're talking about giving up everything your family's built," protested another rancher. "Your grandfather would roll over in his grave if he knew you were considering this." "My grandfather would understand doing whatever it takes to survive," Maria shot back. "He didn't come to this territory to get rich. He came to build a life for his family. If working together as a community is what it takes to keep our families here, then that's what we should do." The debate continued late into the night. Sarah listened to her neighbors argue about independence versus security, tradition versus survival, individual rights versus community needs. She understood their concerns because she shared most of them. Finally, Crawford arrived with official documents from the territorial capital. He had been working with government lawyers to create a legal framework for what Sarah had started. "The territorial government is prepared to accept land donations from any family that chooses to participate," Crawford announced. Families who join the trust would become territorial employees with guaranteed housing and income. They would have collective decision-making authority over land use, water rights, and community development. "What about Thornfield?" asked Henderson. What stops him from just waiting until we fail and then buying the trust land from the government? Territorial trust land cannot be sold to private individuals, Crawford replied. Once land becomes part of the trust, it stays there permanently. Thornfield would have no way to acquire it. This was the first time Sarah had heard this detail, and it convinced her that she had made the right choice. Thornfield's entire scheme depended on eventually owning all the land in the territory. If enough families joined the territorial trust, his plan would become impossible. Over the following 3 days, 4 more families decided to donate their ranches to the territorial trust. The Martinez family, the Hendersons, the Roberts family, and old Pete Wilson, who had been barely hanging on with 30 head of cattle and a half section of barren land. Each family went through the same process Sarah had experienced. They signed away their ownership rights to property that had been in their families for decades. In return, they gained security, community support, and the promise that they could stay on the land they loved even if they couldn't afford to own it anymore. Thornfield's reaction was swift and furious. He arrived at the former Mackenzie Ranch 3 days after Sarah's donation, accompanied by his attorney and 4 hired gunmen who made no attempt to hide the weapons they carried. Sarah was working in her vegetable garden when Thornfield's group rode up to the house. She set down her hoe and walked out to meet them, noting that Miguel and several other ranch hands had also noticed the visitors and were moving into position nearby. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Thornfield said, his previous courtesy replaced by barely controlled anger. "I understand you've made some very foolish decisions regarding your property. I've made the decisions I thought were best for my family and my community," Sarah replied calmly. "Was there something specific you needed?" Thornfield dismounted and stepped closer, clearly trying to use his size and presence to intimidate her. "You've made a serious mistake. This territorial trust scheme of yours is going to fail, and when it does, you'll have nothing. No land, no money, no security." "That's possible," Sarah agreed, "but at least we'll still be here to see what happens next." "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with," Thornfield continued. "I have business interests throughout the territory. I can make life very difficult for people who interfere with my operations." This was the closest thing to a direct threat Sarah had heard from Thornfield, and she felt her anger rising. "Mr. Thornfield, are you threatening me on my own land?" "This isn't your land anymore," Thornfield snapped. "You gave it away, remember?" "You're right," Sarah said with a slight smile. "This is territorial land now, which means you're threatening a territorial employee while trespassing on government property. I wonder what James Crawford would think about that." Thornfield's attorney whispered something urgent in his ear. The businessman's face went through several color changes before he stepped back toward his horse. "This isn't over," he said as he mounted up. "You've cost me a significant investment, and I don't forget things like that." "Good day, Mr. Thornfield," Sarah replied. "Please don't let me keep you from your other business." After Thornfield's group rode away, Miguel approached Sarah with concern written on his weathered face. "Mrs. Mackenzie, that man is dangerous. Maybe we should ask Crawford to station some territorial marshals here for a while." "That might not be a bad idea," Sarah agreed. "But I don't think Thornfield is stupid enough to do anything violent. He's a businessman, not an outlaw." Sarah was right about Thornfield avoiding violence, but she underestimated his determination to sabotage the territorial trust. Over the following weeks, strange problems began affecting the trust families. Supply deliveries from town were mysteriously delayed or canceled. The bank began demanding immediate payment on loans that had been current. The local general store suddenly couldn't get inventory that trust families needed. It became clear that Thornfield was using his economic influence to pressure local businesses into making life difficult for anyone who had joined the trust. He couldn't buy their land anymore, but he could try to make their situation so uncomfortable that they would leave voluntarily. Sarah and the other trust families responded by becoming more self-sufficient. They pooled their resources to buy supplies directly from wholesalers in other territories. They started a credit union to handle their financial needs without relying on the local bank. They even established a community store that served trust families and anyone else who wanted to shop there. What Thornfield hadn't anticipated was that his pressure tactics would actually bring the trust community closer together. Families that had been independent neighbors for years started working as a unified group. They shared equipment, labor, and expertise in ways that made all of them more efficient and resilient. The first real test of the trust system came when autumn arrived and it was time for the cattle roundup. In previous years, each family had handled their own roundup with help from neighbors. Now the trust families combined their remaining cattle into a single herd and worked together to prepare them for winter. Sarah found herself in the unfamiliar position of being a leader in this community effort. The other families looked to her for guidance since she had been the first to make the difficult choice of joining the trust. It was a responsibility she hadn't expected, but one she accepted with determination. "We have about 250 head between all our families," Sarah announced at a community meeting in the old schoolhouse. "That's not enough to be profitable under normal circumstances, but if we work together and keep our costs low, we can make it through the winter." "What about next year?" asked Bill Henderson. "We still don't have enough water to support a larger herd." "That's where some good news comes in," Sarah replied. "Crawford got word from the territorial capital yesterday. The government is planning to invest in drought relief projects, including new wells and water storage systems. Trust communities will get priority for these improvements." This was the first concrete benefit the trust families had seen from their decision to donate their land. The territorial government was treating them as a pilot project for community-based land management. If their experiment succeeded, similar trust communities might be established in other drought-stricken territories. Winter arrived early and hit hard. Snow began falling in October and continued through February. The cold weather was difficult, but the trust families had prepared well. They shared resources, took turns caring for the combined cattle herd, and supported each other through the hardest months. Thornfield made one final attempt to break up the trust community in January. He offered to buy out the territorial government's interest in the trust land at twice its assessed value. When that offer was rejected, he proposed a development partnership that would have given him control over water rights and mineral extraction. The territorial government's response was swift and definitive. Not only were Thornfield's offers rejected, but an investigation revealed that several of his water rights purchases had been based on forged documents. Federal marshals arrived to arrest him in February, ending his schemes permanently. When spring finally arrived, the trust families faced their biggest test yet. The drought hadn't broken, but the new wells funded by territorial investment began producing water in March. For the first time in 3 years, there was enough water to support a normal cattle operation. Sarah stood by the creek that ran behind the house where she and Tom had once planned their future together. The water was flowing again, not from rain, but from the deep wells that the trust community had been able to afford working together. Children from the trust families were playing in the creek, their laughter carrying across the green grass that was starting to grow again. Miguel rode up beside her and dismounted to watch the children play. "Mrs. Mackenzie," he said, "do you ever regret what you did? Giving up the ranch?" Sarah thought about the question for a long moment. The Mackenzie ranch was gone, and with it the dreams she and Tom had shared. But looking around at the thriving community that had taken its place, she felt a different kind of satisfaction. "I gave up owning this land," she said finally, "but I didn't give up belonging to it. Tom and I wanted to build something that would last, something that would help people build good lives. I think we did that, just not the way we originally planned." "What do you think happens next?" Miguel asked. "Next, we keep working," Sarah replied. "We take care of the land, we take care of each other, and we proved that people can choose cooperation over greed. By summer, the trust community was not only surviving, but beginning to prosper. The combined herds had grown to over 400 head. The community had built a school, a clinic, and a meeting hall. Most importantly, they had created a model that other struggling communities across the territory were starting to copy. James Crawford visited in August to write his final report on the Clearwater Territory situation. He found a thriving community where failing ranches had been just 1 year earlier. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Crawford said, as they walked through the community gardens that now flourished where Sarah's private ranch had once struggled, "what you started here has attracted attention from the territorial capital and even Washington. There's talk of establishing trust communities as a permanent solution for drought-affected regions throughout the West." Sarah smiled as she watched children from 5 different families playing together in the schoolyard. "That's good," she said, "but we didn't do this to become famous. We did it to survive and to build something better." "Your deed shocked the whole territory," Crawford observed. "Nobody expected a rancher to give up private ownership voluntarily." "Sometimes shock is what it takes to wake people up to new possibilities," Sarah replied. "Tom used to say that the most important decisions are usually the hardest ones to make." As Crawford prepared to leave, Sarah reflected on everything that had changed since she first walked into the land office that morning in spring. She had given away her ranch but gained a community. She had lost her individual ownership but helped secure the future for dozens of families. She had shocked the territory with her decision but created something that would outlast any private ranch. The drought finally broke in September, arriving with thunderstorms that filled the creeks and turned the brown grass green almost overnight. Sarah stood on the porch of the house that was still her home, watching the rain fall on land that no longer belonged to her but would always be part of who she was. Miguel joined her on the porch, both of them enjoying the sight of water falling from the sky for the first time in 4 years. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Miguel said, "I think Tom would be proud of what you did." "I think he would be proud of what we all did," Sarah corrected. "One person can't build a community alone." As the rain continued to fall on the flourishing trust community, Sarah Mackenzie knew she had made the right choice. Her deed had indeed shocked the whole territory, but sometimes shock was exactly what was needed to create real change. The decision had been hers to make, but its effects would benefit generations of families who would call this place home long after she was gone. The widowed rancher's shocking deed had saved not just her own future, but the future of everyone who chose community over individual gain. In giving up everything she owned, Sarah Mackenzie had gained something far more valuable than private property. She had gained the satisfaction of knowing that her choices had made life better for everyone around her. And that, she realized, was exactly the kind of legacy Tom would have wanted them to leave behind.